Welcome everyone to the launch of the V-Dem Institute Democracy Report 2024, Democracy Winning and Losing at the Ballot. I'm joined here for this launch by Kevin Casas-Zamora, Secretary General of International IDEA, joining us from Stockholm. Welcome, Kevin. Quinn, McKew, Executive Director of Article 19, joining us from London, I believe. Welcome. And Adrian Shahbaz, Vice President for Research and Analysis at Freedom House, joining us from Washington, D.C. Welcome. We're also hoping that Agnès Callamard from the Secretary General of Amnesty International will join us shortly. We will proceed as follows. I will present some highlights from the Democracy Report over about 15 minutes, and then we'll come back for a panel discussion. So let's start with the presentation. Democracy, Winning and Losing at the Ballot. The title reflects winning in cases like Brazil that stop autocratization and turn it around. But democracy also losing because the wave of autocratization continues, and now we see that increasingly also elections are being undermined. We have learned more and more about varieties of not only democracy but of autocratization. The picture is becoming more complex, and I hope this year's report reflects that. It has 5 parts. I'm going to give a few highlights from each of the 5 parts. Starting with democracy in the world. Where are we at? Well, if we look at country-based averages, the mean is back to around 1998 on the Liberal Democracy Index, shown in this graph. But the downward trend is not that marked, and it's also still within confidence intervals. Whereas if we look at it from a population-weighted perspective, so think about it as the level of democracy enjoyed by the average global person, things look much worse, and the decline is much greater, going back to the equivalent of 1985, when Brazil and Uruguay threw off their military dictatorships. Territory weighted, weighted by GDP, the picture looks much the same, with by GDP even worse. So you can think of these as alternative ways of looking at the world and see how much of the world is affected, how much the decline in democracy means for the world. We look a lot at the population-weighted averages in the report because we think of democracy as ruled by the people, and therefore it matters how many people enjoy democratic rights or freedoms. And it's been a depressing last 15 years in a row where the share of the population living in autocratizing countries greatly outweighs the share living in democratizing countries. We also look at it, take the same underlying data that goes into the Liberal Democracy Index and translate it into a less complex reality, simplified into regime categories that you see here on the screen. And we should also remember then that some of these boxes are relatively big boxes, wide boxes. The electoral autocracies, the countries holding multi-party elections, at least on paper, and having some trappings of democracy on paper at least, it's a pretty wide box, all the way from Putin's Russia, where there's not much left, to countries with much more degrees of freedom, like Hungary and India, but that still don't qualify as democracies. We take that perspective, look at the 4 categories over the past 50 years, and the third wave of democratization taking off in the 70s, leading to a lot fewer closed dictatorships, and an increase in democracies, but also an increase in electoral autocracies. Over the past 10 years here, There's an interesting, or say worrisome development where the number of liberal democracies go down, the number of electoral democracies then go up, meaning a number of countries become less good democracies. And at the other end, you have now recently an increase in closed autocracies while a decrease in electoral autocracies, meaning again, autocracies are becoming worse. We'll take the population perspective on this. Again, the same 50 years, and you can see how the increase of the share of the population in the world living in autocracies increase, especially here over the past 20 years. And that's actually quite stark when you look at it in real numbers, from about half of the population to over 70% now. And we see now, we've seen for a number of years, and everybody, others can also testify to this, that freedom of expression is an aspect of democracy that's been undermined the most in many places. But we're also seeing now elections increasingly being undermined. So here's a graph looking at not the index of democracy, but drilling down into the components and different aspects of democracy. You see, so this is from 2013. You see the clean elections index was improving in 23 countries and declining in only 10 over the past 10 years leading up to 2013. Most of the components are above this diagonal line, meaning they improve in more countries than they decline. Compare this now to 2023. Boom. They fall below the line. And worst of all out there, freedom of expression, as we know, but now also increasingly the clean elections index being undermined here in 23 countries over the past 10 years and improving in only 12. There, right now, 60 countries that are in what we call episodes of regime change or regime transformation. They are spread across the world, all regions of the world, especially when we look at the orange-red countries here that are the autocratizing countries. But luckily we have some democratizing countries, including, as we all know, Brazil becoming better again on democracy. Putting this in perspective, over the past 50 years, there have been stark changes over the time. I mean, look at this period marked in green here, the 80s into the 90s and the mid-90s, where we were all happy, right? 70 countries at the same time, moving ahead on democracy. Frank Fukuyama wrote The End of History, and we believed it, right? And then here, the last 20 years, the number of countries democratizing, plummeting, now down to 18 by our latest count, and the number of countries autocratizing going up. There is, and that's actually historical records. You can see here the 50 years, but we could go further back. There's a little bit dent down there on the number at the end, a little bit of up on the democratizing. That could mean the wave has crested, but we should be cautious with that because the methodology we use is quite demanding for countries to sort of qualify as an autocratizer. So there are some countries that have started to change in smaller ways, and we don't know yet if it's going to be sort of a real episode of autocratization. But there are 25 of those. So these numbers can change in the future. Right now, we have moved into a reality where over 1/3 of the world's population live in autocratizing countries. 42 of them right now. So let's look at them. And the outcomes already, although these are still ongoing processes, of the 28 that were democracies of one type or the other when it started, only about half of them are still democracies. The other half, democracy has broken down. And also among these countries that are the autocratizers, we see that elections increasingly are being undermined. And that, of course, is especially significant in this record year of elections 2024. I'll come back to that in a second. But we've also now been able to disentangle these autocratization processes and see really two types. There are the standalone, sort of stable, for a while regimes that then start to autocratize, and there are those that are the sort of failed democratization cases, the ones that were going up but then have rather quickly turned back. Along the standalone autocratization cases, here's the top 10. The ones that have autocratized the most in terms of magnitude of change, right? They have fallen to the greatest extent. Greece, Poland, Mauritius, Hungary, India, Serbia, and so on. What I want to point to, especially in this graph, is towards the end here. You see the regime classifications. 8 out of the 10 no longer qualifies as democracies by our measure. But then there are the bell turn autocratization cases. You can think of them as failed democratization, if you like, and they are very different contexts. Some of them at the very high end, like South Korea. Some of them not even necessarily making it to democracy, and at the lower level. And Haiti is one of them where we know from the news now things are going from bad to worse. These, we think, are really prime cases both for the international community and us as scholars to look at and compare with successful cases of democratization and see what the differences are. What is it that went wrong, that made them abort the democratization path and become autocratizers again? There are some good news, of course. Democratizing countries, although the best news is not that their numbers are decreasing, down to 18 now. It's maybe not also the best news that they only harbor 5% of the world population, and Brazil make about half of that. But there are these cases like Brazil, and Brazil is then one of the prime cases of the sort of opposite to the bell turns we saw. Here are the cases that managed to halt autocratization and turn it around relatively quickly in one process, so to speak. They are also, and we have here Brazil and already sort of classic case of Zambia and Lesotho, but also some new ones and some that are a bit shaky, right, to say the least, like Tunisia or Thailand. But at least the ones that have made substantial improvements, I think also really important cases like we discussed in last year's report for learning what can work to stop autocratization and turn it around. And here is an interesting thing that we discuss in the report and also have a deeper analysis of in this working paper that we put out. If we look at the entire period since 1900, about half of autocratization episodes turn around into U-turns, or democratic turnarounds, if you like. And this share of autocratization episodes that are being turned around has actually increased. So in the last 30 years, it's 70%. That's maybe some hope for the future that we're going into. And speaking about the future, I may finish up with a highlight from the fifth section of the report, the year of elections 2024. And here is some worrying news. More than half of the countries that are holding elections 2024 hold them in contexts that are autocratizing or declining on democracy. But only 3 countries are in processes of democratization. Here is how the numbers look like, where you have to the left there the staple with standalone autocratizers, bell turns, and then these near misses I talked about, the ones that have quite substantially moved down on the liberal democracy index, but are not yet qualifying as autocratizing by our methodology, but they're still in a context that is declining. And only 3 cases of U-turns, and then the others, the gray staples, where we haven't seen any significant movements up or down in the last 5 years or so. That's the perspective. I think that puts this 2024 year of election in a little bit of a worrisome context. And these are the highlights from the report this year, available from our website, of course. And on that note, let me say thank you for listening, and I'm looking forward to hear from our distinguished panelists on your thoughts on the report, on relation to your own reports, and so on. Thank you very much. And now we have also been joined by Agnès. Sorry for the troubles we caused you in joining here. We're very, very happy that you're here. Please feel free to have your cameras on. Agnès Callamard, as I said, Secretary General at Amnesty International, joining us from London, I believe. Welcome. I'm going to ask you to give some brief reflections on what you think are some of the most important, in your mind, things that are discussed in the report. I didn't have a particular order because you're all distinguished, good colleagues and friends. So I just decided to go by the first name in alphabetical order. And then Adrian, I believe you come first.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for having me. It's really an honor to be here with my panelists. We have such respect at Freedom House for the work, obviously of the V-Dem Institute, but also of Article 19, International IDEA, and Amnesty International. So I'm thrilled to be representing Freedom House here. And Staffan, to you and your team, kudos on this report. We know firsthand the amount of work that this takes, some of the long nights and weekends. So I hope you can all take a well-deserved break. This is really fantastic. Just to say a note about Freedom House very briefly. So as I alluded to, Freedom House produces this report, Freedom in the World, which is now in its 51st year. That has a similar mandate around looking at political rights and civil liberties. We also have over 100 staff in 30 countries that are working to support democratization efforts in partnership with local civil society. And I think that really informs our approach, and it's similar to my colleagues here, to the great work that needs to be done. There are 3 things that I wanted to point to that I thought were really important insights to take away from this report. The first was on the bell turns. I thought this was a really innovative way of looking at these bright spots where hopes have perhaps been dashed. And I think it's really important for us to reflect, and for the democracy community to reflect on what exactly went wrong. Staffan, I really appreciate you pointing out that the longer reports about when autocratization is reversed, because I think that it's important. And the countries that were pointed out, it's so fascinating that 5 of these were among the top 10 democratizers over the past decade. So really, these places like Burkina Faso, Myanmar, Libya, Niger, and Armenia, to see the hopes rise and then unfortunately to be dashed. And it's interesting also to me that in so many cases, there's an element of violence, there's an element of insecurity, of an anti-pluralism that then translates into political violence. And I think that for me is one of the big takeaways of this report. The second is on these U-turns, where there actually is some democratization that takes place. And it is interesting, though, I guess a bit unfortunate. These tend to be smaller countries. But for me, when you're looking at Lesotho, the progress that's been made there, Maldives, Zambia, it speaks to an analysis that you brought through in your report, which is that elections can be critical events to halt autocratization. And I think that these three countries are a great example of that. They've also seen improvements on our index. You pointed to Fiji, which I think is another great example. I had an election in 2022, and then I think over time, we've seen the new elected government take steps towards, liberalization. And then the third thing that I wanted to point to is really digging on elections is how important it is that free and fair elections are in decline. That's a data point that we also have tracked. We've seen the countries without free and fair elections jump from 21 18 years ago to now 35 today. Of the 52 countries that declined in our index last year, over half of those had declines that were related to flawed elections. I think we can have a whole discussion about what are the tactics that authoritarians and sort of liberal incumbents are using to manipulate elections. I think it's really fascinating, particularly looking ahead to 2024 being billed as this historic year for elections. But, overall, these are the 3 points that I think for me were a key takeaway. And I really appreciated the shout out to Brazil as an interesting case study. And I think that the report does well to point out the different steps that we're taking within Brazil to safeguard that country's elections. And of course, we're monitoring closely to see what happens since then. So thank you, Staffan.
Thank you for those initial reflections, Adrian. And let me hand it over then to Agnès from Amnesty and your focus on human rights and what your thoughts are.
Thank you very much, Staffan. It's a pleasure to be joining you finally. Sorry for the technical hiccup. So first of all, congratulations. It's, as usual, an extremely important report for us all. Amnesty International does not work on democratization or autocracies per se. We've had historically a fairly well-entrenched position that we do not take a position on political regime, but rather on how those different states act vis-à-vis their international human rights obligations. Over the last 5 years, that position has become increasingly challenged internally and externally. And we have a lot of debate within the Amnesty movement as to how can we accommodate democracy and democratization better or more centrally than we have done thus far. I think later in the meeting, I'll return to that point and let you know how we're progressing on that one. But I wanted first to focus on the report, the 2024 report, and some of my I have a bit more than 3 points, so I'll go very quickly. First of all, as usual, I think it's the aggregate story, which for me is really very important. Yes, we certainly need to zoom on more sub-story, but the overall large story, I think, is important to understand and to repeat. It's a repeat from last year, more or less, in terms of the level of democracy being enjoyed, moving us back to 1985 levels, if you take a population standpoint. And to me, that's really a very important central message that we need to hold and put first and foremost as we strategize and prioritize within our respective organization. Second key issues is around the components of democracy that are getting worse: freedom of expression, freedom of association, and elections. We've already heard about what the importance of the clean election, which is emerging right now. Free speech and freedom of association have been at the heart of Amnesty's work and is becoming more so because of the decline in these two issues. We have had since last year a campaign on protecting freedom to protest. I also think that the point you're making around autocratizing countries and large populations, with the exception of Brazil and South Africa, is important. I very much, I was challenged by your analysis around BRICS, but maybe we can come back to that. And the analysis between autocracies, democracies, and economic share of global growth, I thought was interesting and raised a number of questions. You know, I'm like the previous speaker. I think the U-turn, the bell turn, give a lot of food for thought, particularly in terms of how we're going to work. You know, what we need to prioritize, which countries we should invest in, and why. So thank you very much for, you know, for a great report.
Thank you so much, Agnès, and for those initial comments. And then ask Kevin, for your perspective. You have the Global State of Democracy report and all the important work that IDEA also does.
Well, thank you so much. First of all, Staffan, for the very kind invitation, and just as like the others have said, I'm honored to be here. And let me start by congratulating the V-Dem Institute. First of all, for, I mean, and I always say this, for the wonderful resource that you've created for all of us. I mean, in many cases, we wouldn't be able to do the work we do to monitor democracy without the enormous work that has gone on the part of V-Dem to create the database that you've created over many years. So congratulations on that, but also congratulations on this report. And let me just say that, just like Adrian was saying, I know how difficult this is. I know that well, because we put out the latest iteration of our report last November, and it's really a labor of love. We've been asked to give a sense of how the findings of this report compare to some of the findings in ours. And let me just say, you know, just as a headline thing, that the main finding of our report is similar. I mean, what we found was a generally gloomy picture when it comes to democracy globally, with a few bright spots, and it's very important not to lose sight of those bright spots. Also, the fact that the attributes that decline the most, according to your report, are the same ones that we found were in trouble, namely election integrity, freedom of expression, and civic space. And the question of election integrity is particularly crucial. You know, this is a global elections year, and one of the things that we are seeing in many places is that the credibility of electoral processes is under strain on account of the autonomy of electoral authorities being curtailed, on account of deliberate efforts to disseminate disinformation, on account of the proliferation of election denialism. So all these things are making for a very challenging environment for elections. So this is crucial, but it's also vital. And here the report to your credit, mentions this several times, and this is something that we should do well to reflect upon. One of the very few things that we know about turning autocratization processes, backsliding processes around is that, when you look at the few cases where that happened, cases like Poland, like Brazil, like Zambia, it happens as a result of key elections. And I guess the practical implication of this is that as long as the electoral route for political change is open, there's hope to turn an autocratization process around. And this is a very important thing that we should bear in mind. I mean, protecting election integrity is truly of the essence. Perhaps the most important difference between this report, this excellent report that just came out, and ours is, in our report, one of the things that we found was that the set of attributes that is related to participation levels in democracy, in our case, was surprisingly robust. I mean, those attributes still look vigorous in most parts of the world, despite the efforts of governments to curtail civic space. People keep, standing up for their rights and going out on the street and demanding their rights as they see them. This, in our case, it counts for a piece of good news, in terms of the future of democracy. This is less prominent in your report. My last comment, Staffan, is as much a comment as it is a question. Particularly the early part of the report makes a lot of the notion of the average democratic performance, whether it be weighted by population, by GDP, by different factors. I'm not sure how helpful that is, and this is an honest question. First of all, I mean, I have questions when you talk about the average performance. I have questions about the weighting of the different attributes, right? Does someone living in Singapore, where elections are suspect, but the rule of law is surprisingly good, have more or less democracy than, I don't know, someone in many places in Latin America where elections are credible, but the rule of law is weak? What does it mean for the average of Mexico, the fact that the president went after the electoral authority? How does it compare to the fact that hundreds of thousands of people were able to demonstrate peacefully to oppose that change? In the case of India, I mean, what matters more, the fact that the leader of the opposition was convicted on flimsy charges, or the fact that the Supreme Court reversed that conviction? So the weighting of the attributes can be problematic when we talk about average performance. Then there's the question of time. When you say that the average level of democracy enjoyed today is similar to the level of democracy that a person in 1986 enjoyed. Well, I'm not sure we're talking about the same democratic experience when in 1986, things like, your ability to go and express yourself online was not a thing, when internet shutdowns was not a thing, when the ability of governments to engage in electronic surveillance was a shadow of what it is today. So, I'm not sure that we're talking about the same level of democracy experienced by someone. And then there's finally the question of what the average performance means in countries that are very big and that have multiple levels of democratic governance. And here, inevitably, and I know that this has been a point of contention for you, the question of India comes to mind. I mean, whatever one may think about some fairly problematic things that are happening at the national level. I have the impression that we focus too much on the national level, and in the case of India, we might be missing the fact that at the subnational level, the Indian democracy remains, as far as I can tell, as boisterous and as chaotic as ever. You know, the last time I was in India, elections in the state of Karnataka, which is a very big state, happened, and the BJP got clobbered. So this is just to say that I understand that the average performance might be a useful heuristic device to tell a story, to depict trends, to support a narrative, but you can tell the same story, and you do tell the same story in many other different ways without necessarily resorting to a device that, in my view, can be in some ways problematic. So I'll stop there. But kudos to the team, because it's yet another contribution to our debates coming from V-Dem, and it's much appreciated.
Thank you so much, Kevin, for those initial reflections. And now, happy to move. I'll come back, of course, we'll come back to a conversation here. But first, I want to invite Quinn, Executive Director, Article 19. And you also have a report coming out in May, I believe, the next iteration of freedom of expression.
Yes. So first, Staffan and the team at V-Dem, again, congratulations on the release of your reports. I think all of us know how hard it is to put these out there. And it's really wonderful to be part of this dialogue and conversation with such great colleagues who also put out such amazing pieces of research to really benchmark where we are in the world and where we're going. Article 19 is, as you know, is an international freedom of expression organization that works so that all people everywhere can realize the power of their voices. And with that focus on freedom of expression, I wanted to highlight a few things that particularly stuck out for me in the V-Dem reports that we're pleased to have today. First of all, kind of echoing Agnès' point about the big picture, I think it is incredibly important to look at the big picture in the world. And for me, when I look at the overall statistics, you said that the report points to how 29% of the world's population, only 29%, currently live in a liberal or electoral democracy. But yet, the picture for freedom of expression, for our own global expression report, which, thank you, Staffan, that's going to be coming out at the end of May. You can find the ones for previous years. It's globalexpressionreport.org. But our own expression report last year that came out showed that only 13% of the world's population currently live in countries where freedom of expression is categorized as open. So that means if you look at the 29% in liberal or electoral democracies and only 13% of the world that actually experience true freedom of expression, you can see that even in the democracies that we have, as your report points out as well, we have a real crisis. We have a crisis of freedom of expression. And for me, and one thing we like to emphasize is that freedom of expression, and I think it's actually ably pointed to in the V-Dem report, is not a nice to have feature of democracy. You will not have democracy without freedom of expression. When you see improvements in those democratizing countries, one of the things that seems to be driving that are big changes in the freedom of expression scores, particularly freedom from government censorship of information and harassment of the media. So one of the things we like to point out, and maybe you can encourage, is that if you're truly looking at ensuring a world where people can realize their fundamental freedoms that are so much inherent in the concept of democracy in terms of rule of law and other things, you really need to look at what is the state of freedom of expression and view that as a fundamental precursor and an absolute necessity for ensuring that people can realize the power of their voices through a democratic process. Also, if you look big picture, I mean, freedom of expression is a human right enshrined in international law. But bigger than that, and this gets a little bit into the V-Dem territory and the IDEA territory and Freedom House and others, is that voting is fundamentally an expressive act. the ability to go and feel that your voice can be heard through a ballot that you're doing is fundamentally an expressive act. So in the V-Dem report, you have a number of declining categories. I think the top three were, I think, government censorship, freedom of expression, government censorship, and free and fair elections, and the freedom of association and assembly. Well, I actually think all three of those are fundamentally expressive acts if you look at it bigger picture. And so that's one of the things I think we really need to look at, is that what we see in the trends in autocracy is actually about silencing people, silencing voices, silencing information, so that that power can be enhanced and control can be enhanced of individuals. So those are some of the key points that I was taking out from the V-Dem report. I actually thought another one that was really interesting was the connection you were making, and maybe there'll be a discussion between Agnès and I as well on this, about the economic power of the BRICS and the relationship between kind of increasing economic power and increasing autocratization or challenges of autocracy in different places in the world. We've seen that as well in our own Global Expression report, where you increasingly see that the economic arguments that were linked to democracy leads to democratic good, leads to like economic good. With that seeming to be broken, then there's increasing questions of the things that are fundamentally making up democracy, including freedom of expression. Do you need freedom of expression to be a wealthy country? And I think those are some of the questions that we need to have an answer to in terms of our own research and in the broader community for human rights activists in the world. So those would be some of the key things that I've taken out. And the final one is the point I'd like to make around violence, which isn't necessarily highlighted in the V-Dem report, but there are a number of indicators that the report touches on that actually touch on harassment of journalists, freedom from political killings, and those sorts of things. I would actually say that even though the violent aspects of repression do not stand out as much in the report, they're actually deeply impactful and meaningful. For example, in Mexico, it's one of the biggest slaughtering grounds of journalists in the world, right? So even though you might have other trappings of democracy there, you have a state where there's impunity for killings. There's questions of whether the rule of law would function to actually bring justice for those who are killed, and people know that. So it acts as an overall silencing and dampening effect of democratic participation across the board, because even those killings that are directed at journalists or others. So I do think that there's a role that we need to, in the broader human rights community, think about how violence and violent actions actually are amplified in terms of their effect and the ways that that can be seen in the data or not going forward. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much, Staffan.
Thank you, Quinn. Thanks for pointing to those aspects of freedom of expression, of course, and also the economic power that Agnès also brought up, and I think is something we could discuss. We have a little bit of time left, and I would like to also invite sort of a conversation between you if you also have comments on each other's comments or reflections in extension of those, and maybe also think about what if there's anything at this stage, you know, judging from our report and your own reports and work, that you think is becoming more important for the policy practitioner community out there, what to think about, what they should take home and going forward in their important work. But let me just say 2 words to Kevin and to your question. I think the big value of the population weighted averages for the world is to show just what Quinn and Agnès and Adrian also spoke about, sort of the big picture here. You can look at it at country averages, population weighted, and economic or by economic power and so on. It's very true. I mean, of course, there are a number of countries that are much more democratic today than they were in 1985 or 86, but there's also the reverse, and it's not the same context. We're not living in the same context. No country is, right? We're not going back in time in that sense. But it's I think important to get a sense of where we are in relation to sort of how the world has looked before. How far has the development gone? And then I invite everyone to sort of use this to dig deeper into the V-Dem data and the country developments that I think we also show where it's not about population weighted, but we try to get a grip of the big picture here. The weighting is a sort of a long discussion, I guess, with the different, but it's with any index that has many things that go into it, you can have very different situations that get the same measure on an index. That's a sort of a necessary, unavoidable loss of information, if you like, that comes with indices. Let me stop there, and now everybody wants to join the conversation, so just join in and let's not be too formal. I'm not sure. I think Agnès was first, and then you know it, and you, unmute and talk.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to add a few complexity maybe to the complex story that you are telling. First, I mentioned the fact that we at Amnesty don't work on democracy or authoritarian regime per se, but what we are doing now is working on authoritarian practices. And why we picked that focus rather than the, meta type of regime that you have adopted is because, as Quinn, I think, pointed out, sadly, it's becoming increasingly difficult to distinguish between type of regimes on the basis of their practices. And the reason why so many democracies are going through a downward spiral is because they are adopting authoritarian practices. We decided to adopt the approach that the political scientist Marlis Glazius has adopted on authoritarian practices, which is she defines as patterns of action that sabotage accountability to people over whom a political actor exerts control by means of secrecy, disinformation, and disabling voices. And a focus on practices has allowed us at least to shift or, not to have to designate a regime as authoritarian or democratic, recognizing that in the 21st century complex world we live in, governance arrangements have become very fluid. And I think that's what your report is also highlighting. And to me, it reinforces our decision to focus on practices, identify those practices that are part and parcel of the authoritarian playbook, whoever is adopting it, whether it's called Putin or Joe Biden. So that's the first point. The second, in relation to that, is around international politics, international rule of law, and the normative framework, which I think many of us will highlight is under a great deal of distress and challenges right now. That's something that Amnesty does try to bring into our storyline, and that's make it much more complex. So if you look, for instance, at the way governments around the world are dealing with the crisis in Gaza, you will find that the so-called democratic regime are prepared to basically turn away from the massacres and the very high risk of genocide taking place in Gaza, while the so-called authoritarian regimes are going to the ICJ, of all places, the ICJ, which is the hallmark of international accountability, to deliver accountability. So that to me, of course, you're going to say instrumentalization and so on and so forth. Nobody's going to deny that there are double standards on everywhere. But I think it is making maybe the large dichotomy that the report is creating a little bit more difficult to act upon from a strategic standpoint. And for an international organization like us, who have, half of our sections are in the so-called global south, if not more, we are very, very aware of the fact of the incredible defect of our so-called democratic regimes and of the incredible downturn that they are taking both internally and externally, making it very difficult to suggest that democratic regime have anything to offer for a peaceful and safe future. Now, I may be a little bit too, gloomy here, but I just think it's important to highlight the fact that those so-called democratic regimes owe a great deal of responsibility for the theocratization of the world that you have identified, and that every time a so-called democratic regime turn its way on international law, on international rule of law, on international instruments, such as the International Criminal Court, we are facing a great deal more difficulties to pretend that these are the hallmark of development for civilization. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I can certainly agree with from my perspective, looking at the data in this report as well. I also have a kind of a gloomy picture of where the world is heading. We have about 7 minutes left. Adrian, I think you were next, right? If you want to come in, but
great. I'll try to be short because I want to make sure that we can get to Quinn and Kevin as well. And I really appreciate this part of it where we can have more of a discussion. And I really think that what the other panelists said is excellent. I really align with a lot of what they said, although I do have some disagreements. I think that on free expression, that's such an incredible, important part of what makes a democracy. And I think we all have a sense of democracy is much more than elections. And Quinn, I really like your framing of election also as an expressive act. I think that that's a really important point to be made. And then just in the practical sense, you can't have a free election if people can't speak freely, if you don't have a free media, if people are not able to campaign. So I think that it's really important that we think of democracy not purely as elections, but also within all of the civil liberties that we track. On this point about regime type, I agree that it is quite tricky whenever we're picking regime types because it can feel a bit arbitrary at times. And with the scoring, what we have relied on is, so as Freedom in the World, our report that came out last week, we are grouping categories of countries as free, partly free, or not free. And so the emphasis is actually on the experience of freedom of the people living in that place. So it's the people who are at fault could be the government, it could be a foreign government, it could be a non-state actor that is inhibiting the freedom of people living in a particular place. And I think that that's important. And within that, I also do think it's important that we don't fall into a bit of moral relativism, because there is a key difference of the level of freedom that you have, living under a Vladimir Putin or a President Biden. And I do think that it's, when we're thinking about where, even according to our data, the Freedom House, the decline over the past 18 years has, for the most part, come in autocracies getting more repressive. So we've seen a decline in the not free countries, and particularly on civil liberties. So there's an increasing willingness among the world's most repressive regimes to engage in even more repression. Russia's a great example of that. China, another example of that. And we can talk about all of the countries that we're all familiar with, where those in power, sometimes who've been elected, are then doing everything that they can to crack down on free expression, to deny political competition so that they can remain in power. They become deeply corrupt, and they impose tyranny on their own populations. And I think that's a really important story as we kind of take a step back in the aggregate. That and then it's interesting too, when we are thinking about violence, which I agree is a really important point here. The territory that declined the most in our index was Nagorno-Karabakh. You had the campaign by Azerbaijan to root out, forcibly expel over 100,000 ethnic Armenians from the territory. Agnès commented about, the violence that is happening in Gaza as we speak. And I think it's important too that when you look at a country like Israel, it's a country that in our index has declined by 10 points over the past decade or so, or since 2008. So we've seen, democratic backsliding in Israel. I believe that they went down in your index as well in V-Dem. So I think that it's also incredibly important when we think about conflict, when we think about violence, that democracy is a very important component of that. And when we start to see checks and balances reduced, when we start to see discrimination systematically imposed within a country, that has these after effects of increasing violence.
Yeah, thank you. And that's true for for Israel with our measures too, and falling out of the liberal democracy category. And now we have 3 minutes left, and I'm gonna ask Quinn to share it in a equal way as much as possible with Kevin. So, Quinn, do you want to first?
Sure. I'll say I had other points I was going to make, but just to reflect a little bit, kind of taking what Adrian and Agnès have said about this issue of oftentimes declines happen in terms of the advancers and decliners. Oftentimes there is some big violent movement that leads to a dramatic decline. But in many of the countries over time, you can see that there has been a decline, and people, governments, intergovernmental processes tends to overlook that. And this is one of the messages that I keep trying to get across when people set aside particularly big declines in freedom of expression or things that are related to the violence attached to repressing voices, whether protest or otherwise, is when the big shifts happen, when Russia goes all like dictatorship, when Israel goes off a cliff, you haven't been paying attention to what's preceded it. And this is where I think indicators like V-Dem, like our other reports that we do, are so useful, because it points out to where even your friends are failing. And those areas need to be paid attention to. Friends, the ones in the middle category, particularly the ones that could go up or down, or even at the bottom. Please pay attention to what it's that old thing with relationships, right? When someone tells you who they are, believe them. And oftentimes we tend to not believe countries when they're telling us who they are.
Yeah. We don't have any friends. We just rate countries. But in Europe, yeah, very worrying developments in Greece, for example. So, Kevin, please.
Yeah. Well, Staffan, I'll take you up on your question about what the key takeaways from this should be. I mean, at least from my part, I mean, given the findings of this excellent report and what's already happening in the world this year, this huge array of elections, I would say that the key takeaway is that we have to do our best to protect electoral integrity. And that means, number one, taking very seriously the attempts on the part of incumbents to clip the wings of often very competent, very robust election management bodies. And one idea that comes to mind that has been floated at different times is that in the same way that we have international rapporteurs for the independence of judges, we should have a, international rapporteur, an international rapporteur for the autonomy and independence of election management bodies. And the second thing is that we should all go very hard after those political actors, incumbents or not, that try to undermine the credibility and the legitimacy of election results without any evidence, because that's simply disloyal behavior. And we should be very, very hard on those that engage in that kind of and that that kind of discourse. So this would be my key takeaway. I mean, let me just finish by saying that I find it slightly odd that someone said that it is autocracies that have activated the International Court of Justice in the case of Gaza. I mean, latest I checked, it was a democracy, South Africa, that did so. Just pointing out. Thank you.
Thank you. And thanks all of us. We could have gone on here for days probably, and we should continue this conversation. It's so important to figure out what is happening in the world and what can be done about the negative trends. I really would have wanted to continue this conversation. We're already a couple of minutes over time, but I also encourage everyone listening here to check out the V-Dem website. 31 million data at your hands. There are also online tools to play around with, and look at country developments and detailed specifics, some 600 indicators. And I also must end with saying a big thank you, first of all, to you, Agnès, Adrian, Kevin, and Quinn, for joining us today on this launch. Really, my most heartfelt thank you for your contributions and willingness to be here. And then I want to say a big thank you to the entire team at the V-Dem Institute that have made this report possible, and from recruiting experts to doing the graphs and the layout and everything. I'm so grateful to the entire team. Thank you all. It was too short, but you've really put out a number of really important reflections and comments, not only on the report, but in general on what your reports and what we should think about going ahead, both as analysts and as policy practitioners and activists. So thank you so much, and thanks to everybody who have been listening and attending this webinar. Thank you all.